Okay? Now, the Democrats, as you might expect, by the way, why do you think the Republicans use a process like that? I tell you what, hang on to that question. Let me explain it to you how the Democrats work in Texas. This is not true in all the states, it's just Texas. In Texas, the Democrats, where 75% of the delegates are determined by the primary voting. That Texas had to the Democratic National Convention in 2004?
232.
232. So somebody don't just calculate it quietly in your own mind.
75% of that?
232, whatever that number is, that was determined by primary voting. Okay? Furthermore, that primary voting is, primary votes are awarded proportionally. I can't write and talk at the same time.
Is that like 190?
Yeah, it doesn't matter what the actual number is. Okay? If they're awarded proportionally, so that if we have the same sort of situation where there are three candidates seeking the Democratic on the ballot, the Democratic primary in Texas, I don't remember what the numbers were they 45, 15, right? They're not awarded winner take all. That 75% of 232 is not awarded on a winner-take-all basis for the Democrats. It's awarded proportionally. So if candidate A got 45% of the vote, candidate A would have 45% of the 75% pledged to him. That make sense? Candidate B would have, 40%, and C would have 15%. Okay? The other 25% are determined by a caucusing process. So let's see how the primaries and caucuses work. Presidential preference primaries. Okay, so we know Texas has 232 delegates to the Democratic. Here's what happens in a primary. Voters, as we kind of described earlier, turn out on the day of the primary. They queue up, to vote, wait for their turn to get into the voting booth. They cast their ballots. And I'm going to try to get through this here pretty quickly. They're open at 7 a.m. They close at 7 p.m., right? So we go through that period. We get to the end of the day. The last few voters are casting their ballots. Okay, there's the last one, right? You count up the votes, and here's how it turns out in my hypothetical. The candidates, by the way, in 2004, these were 5 of the candidates that were on the ballot. Howard Dean, John Kerry, John Edwards, former General Wesley Clark, and former Senator Carol Moseley Braun from Illinois. Okay? And you can see in my hypothetical the breakdown of the vote. 17, 44, 17%, etc. Now, the Democrats have a rule in their party rules where a candidate has to get at least 15% of the primary vote to get any delegates. And anybody getting less than 15% of the vote are not eligible to receive delegates, and so the votes are sort of retabulated and redistributed. So you might get an outcome that looks sort of like this, right? Where in this case John Kerry gets 50% of the vote, and so half of the delegates from the state. Okay? Howard Dean 20%, John Edwards 30%. Okay? Now what's the next step? Presumably those delegates that were awarded by the primary voting go to the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Boston, Massachusetts in 2004, and they nominate the presidential candidate. All right, now let's see how this works when we talk about caucuses. How are caucuses different? It's still a process of selecting delegates, right? So selecting delegates to what? Ultimately, the party's national convention. Okay, now think about a state like Iowa, which strictly uses caucuses. Okay? This is the process that we're about to describe would apply to all of the delegates from Iowa, which in 2004 to the Democratic National Convention was what? Okay, so those 50, see that number 56 there for Iowa? All 56 of those delegates would have been chosen according to the process that I'm about to describe to you. In Texas, how many of the delegates would have been chosen according to Senate of 232. We've already described the process of how 75% of that 232 are chosen, right? Okay, so in Iowa, Texas, other states that use caucuses, here's what happens. Voters go to a local precinct convention, and they publicly declare their support for a particular candidate. One of the differences between primaries and caucuses, primary voting is a secret ballot. Caucus voting is not a secret ballot. Okay? The candidate, and at some point during the course of the precinct convention meeting, the chair of the convention asks voters to caucus with others who have declared their support for a particular candidate. And that probably means relocating, physically relocating to another part of the room, right, where they're holding this precinct convention. So that maybe all of the Kerry supporters are asked to move to this part of the room, all of the Howard Dean supporters up here, all of them have that 15% rule, that threshold, okay, so that if Carol Moseley Braun doesn't have enough support, then those people who turned out for Carol Moseley Braun are going to have to caucus with some other group, okay? Now, what are they doing in this caucus? What is a caucus? What are they caucusing about? What is the purpose of this process?
Select delegate.
To select delegates, right? To go to a national nominating convention. All of those people who turned out for John Kerry to this precinct convention, what do you think their main concern is in this process of selecting delegates?
Main concern.
Yeah, I mean, when they're considering whether or not they want to select Joe Smith as a delegate, what is the main thing they want from Joe Smith?
Not to.
Think about this for a second. You turned out to this precinct convention because you support John Kerry to be the next president of the United States. And you understand that ultimately the decision is going to be made by delegates at a national nominating convention. What assurances do you want from whoever it is you select to go to this convention? What do you want to hear them say?
What you want to hear?
What is it that you want to hear?
That they support.
That they support John Kerry, right? You want to know that this person is really a John Kerry supporter, right? Okay? Now, we're not going to go straight from this precinct convention to the national nominating convention. This is an incremental process. What they're actually doing at the precinct convention is selecting delegates to go to the next level, a convention, or maybe a senatorial district convention. And they do the same thing at this level, at the county convention. All of the Howard Dean supporters, caucus, all of the John Edwards supporters caucus, all of the John Kerry supporters caucus. What are they doing? They're selecting delegates to go to the next level, which is typically a state convention. And at the state convention, then they come up with a final list of delegates to go to the national nominating convention. Okay? Does that make sense?